Hi all, Rob here. A quick note before we start. This is obviously part 2 of our interview with Ismail. Part 1 is of course a little long, but it does inform our discussion here. So we would encourage anybody that hasn't listened to it to listen to it. Or at the very least, to read his profile in the Washington Post that will be dropped below. Thank you and enjoy the interview.
Hey guys, welcome to Church Coffee, Christianity, Conservatism, and Culture. I am your co-host, Walter, with Rob.
Hello.
I'm going to pass it to you, Rob.
And today we are talking with Ismail Royer. He's the Director of Islam and Freedom Religious Action Team at the Religious Freedom Institute, whose mission and vision is working to secure religious freedom for everyone, everywhere. Ismail, glad to have you back.
Thank you for having me back.
Yeah.
So I think we'll just jump right in. We already did a part 1 with you and your story, and of course your favorite coffee, which is the most important question we'll ever ask anybody. We'll just go ahead and jump right in. So unfortunately, many people only have a cursory understanding of Islam, like from vague remembrances from high school history class, or maybe a college religious course, or even worse, maybe from a short and politically charged segments on 24-hour news channels or other such bias or just slanted sources. What books or podcasts or even other social media accounts would you recommend about Islam that are nuanced enough yet digestible enough for a general audience who might want to know just a little bit more about Islam, and that can maybe also counter any misconceptions about the religion?
I mean, that's a tough question. I think that, what I would really point people to right now, what I'm really, really digging is this sheikh who, like an Islamic studies teacher named Waleed Mossad. So his name is spelled Walead, and the last name is M, like in Mary, O, S as in Sam, A-A-D. And if you Google him and, look on YouTube for his videos, he's got some really, really nice videos that some of them are kind of, presuppose, some more background knowledge. I think he's a very, very good presenter of the religion. Now, this is not, he's not doing apologetics or anything. He's really talking to Muslims, basically. So, but you'll get an idea. Another person I really like is Hamza Yusuf. I myself have had done a few interviews with him on that are on YouTube, and he's got many, many videos on YouTube that one can watch. Some of them that are kind of geared towards non-Muslims, where he's in a non-Muslim audience or a mixed audience, and others which are geared towards Muslims, and either one would be, I think, useful. And then there are some other speakers too, but I would recommend those two.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Sounds good. What is it like being an American convert to Islam? Do you face prejudice within the Muslim community, or is it more like akin to being a Spanish-speaking immigrant where there's greater bigger umbrella because all Muslims are a minority in the West?
That's an interesting question. I think that there's sort of like two things going on at the same time. On the one hand, you've got the fact that you do have some kind of intra-Muslim fault lines, as I'm sure there are among many other places. So you've got Arabs, you have Indo-Pakistani, you have African-American converts, you have white converts, you have, converts of many different backgrounds, Hispanic and so on. And then you have, so there's that kind of issue there. And I wouldn't say that that there are very bad issues between them, but, they exist. As a white convert, there are some particular challenges, one of which is that if people don't know you, they're often suspicious that you might be a spy or something, which is very sad. But that's the reality of the situation after 9/11 and after sort of law enforcement focus on Muslims and mosques and so on. And so that, you get that. That's if people don't know you, if you're new to a community or new, right. That's just the sad reality of it. There's also something going on right now where there's been kind of a increasing emphasis in our culture in general on race, so especially among a lot of young people. There's some, you see this more on social media, I think, than in real life. Potentially on like college campuses and stuff too. But you see this increasing identification of Islam with ethnicity rather than the religion itself, which is a process of secularization, really. And it just tracks the general secularizing trends in the United States, which are happening on the left and the right, actually. Mm-hmm. And so that's, and you also have a sort of fascination among many young Muslims, especially college-age Muslims, with ideologies like critical race theory and things that are cropping up. And so, these tend to complicate and get in the way of people's relationships with other Muslims. But countervailing trends are that, or countervailing forces are that often many Muslims, but this is now tending to be like older Muslims, but it's certainly among young people too. They're really glad to meet converts, and then on the other hand, you also have a lot of camaraderie among converts. And that's converts of all stripes. So I know many African American converts or Hispanic converts that are, we all bond over being converts.
Right. What's really interesting is I was actually driving in a neighborhood, predominantly Hispanic neighborhood, and I saw for the first time a Hispanic Spanish-speaking mosque.
Oh yeah.
And I was like, oh, okay. Oh, there we go. Sweet. And right, I know there's Hispanic Muslims and stuff. I just hadn't seen that. I'm more used to African American. That's Arab. That's what I normally see.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that because there are apparently an increasing number. Since the 90s, there has been a very strong Puerto Rican Muslim presence in New York, and among Central Americans, or North America, like Mexico, and up into Texas and so on. I definitely know of many Hispanic converts. There's a very, very strong movement there. Of course, not as strong as towards evangelicalism or whatever, but there is. They do exist. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually saw the first Muslim convert in Mexico is going to run for their parliament coming up.
Oh,
really?
That's interesting. Mm-hmm. Wow. Huh.
Yeah. Because I'd imagine, not to digress to Mexican politics and whatnot.
Yeah, because of course we are all very in tune with Mexican politics.
Yeah, I read about it every day. I don't know about you guys.
Yeah.
I would say this, it'd be fascinating is to discuss ethnicity and race and how it relates in Christianity to Islam, even to Judaism. That would be a panel.
Yeah, that would be really fascinating.
Maybe we can organize that for a part 2. Get Ismail back and someone else.
How do you define Islamophobia? Is it a problem on the decline or the rise? And even thinking about what does that mean as Islam in America is becoming more diverse?
First of all, I totally oppose the concept of Islamophobia. I don't believe that it's a real thing, and I don't agree with the term Islamophobia.
Okay.
And I'll explain what I mean. I don't mean, of course, that it's not a real thing that Muslims face prejudice or bigotry or whatever. Certainly they do experience that, particularly those who are obviously Muslim. Mm-hmm. And this is often women, wearing hijab, the headscarf.
Right.
That this can manifest in different ways. And then you have, of course, the fact that the Trump administration really is, part of a political strategy, demonized Muslims, following the advice of Steve Bannon and so on, as just kind of as a way of pandering to a particular segment of the population. So that can't be denied. And then there's the broader issue. I've been working since the 90s, early 90s, or mid to early to mid 90s in the field of Muslim civil rights. So I've presented at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission on Muslim civil rights and challenges that they face, say in the workplace or whatever. So I'm very, very familiar intimately with these sort of things. But my problem with the term Islamophobia is that it's a concept which necessarily includes within it the concept of Islam being not a religion but an identity, quote unquote.
Okay.
And therefore it's a secularizing term. It's a term that renders Islam nothing more than an identity marker. Evidence of this is that some of the most prominent, exponents of this term, and those who raise this issue are in fact very either heterodox or secular Muslims claiming to come under this this label of Islamophobia, but it's like you're not even really Orthodox Muslims at all. So in what sense are you even complaining about Islam at all? If people want to say that there's like anti-Muslim bigotry, that I think is a much better term that would in fact encompass I think So for example, you have like people who are even sometimes Sikhs are targeted by people who think they're Muslims, and so I just don't.
Very different religions.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and so I just don't find it. And also, there's another thing is the way in which it is being used, which is as part of the. It's become absorbed into the critical race theory. Thing. And it's just, I just don't find it a helpful term. We dealt with, typical civil rights violations and so on, for over a decade without, the benefit of this term, which really only began to be bandied around in like 2001 or two or something like that. And at least in America, and wasn't even used until later. So, I just don't agree with the term. I don't like it. And not to mention the fact that using the term phobia with Islam is, that's not, that's not really appropriate either, because you're not, it's not that people are, it's not that people who hate Islam and Muslims are like afraid of Islam per se and so on. So phobia kind of indicates a sort of pathology. Whereas as a Muslim, I would say that if someone hates Islam, they don't have some sort of like psychological pathology. They're a disbeliever who hates the truth for one reason or another. You know what I'm saying? So in other words, like, if someone comes to me and says, "Oh, I hate Islam," I say, "Oh, okay. That's because you either A, don't know the truth and are not familiar with it. And so you hate Islam because you don't know it. Or you know that you understand Islam perfectly, you understand what it is, and you hate it, and so therefore you're just someone who falls into that category of a disbeliever, And that doesn't mean I therefore like am at war with you or have enmity with you, If you have enmity towards me, then then I'll have to deal with trying to overlook that or cope with that or something like that. But if you, let's say you're my neighbor or whatever, and you just say, well, I think Islam is a terrible thing. I understand it perfectly. I just don't like it. I'll say, okay, well, that's fine. But now why don't we work together on, keeping our street clean or keeping, or animal welfare in our community, or dealing with this liquor store that's trying to set up, near our the daycare or something like that. You know what I mean? So yeah. In other words, that the person's hatred of Islam, does not prevent me from having a good relationship with them. And I don't see them as Islamophobic. I just see them as someone who's a disbeliever. Now, if there's a different issue where someone is like being violent towards me and so on, but those are matters handled through through law or through whatever else. I just don't agree with the use of it. I think we can all debate and discuss without getting into like trying to pathologize people who disagree with us.
Fascinating. Yeah. So let me try to ask it this way. Do you think that concept of anti-Muslim sentiment or, Do you
is
think
on the
it's
rise.
on the rise or no?
That's a good question. I think that in certain segments it is. I mean, look, I also have to say that before things like the World Trade Center bombing in '93 or the Africa bombings and in Tanzania and Kenya or of course 9/11 or 7/7 in England. I mean, if it were not for these incidents, we would still be having to, we would still be having to cope with the difficulties of, sort of pluralism and what happens when groups, live among other groups and so on. I mean, just in the same way that you have all kinds of, different, you have all kinds of like societal tensions and so on. And of course, there are different historical backgrounds for that, when it comes to Islam. But these incidents that I mentioned that were carried out by people professing to be acting in the name of Islam have no doubt made things exponentially more difficult for Muslims in the United States, and they did that on purpose. That's actually the one of the primary goals of these terrorists is to try to drive a wedge between Muslims living in the West, peacefully, trying to just coexist, live their lives, and the broader society. And so, if you can look at like Anwar al-Awlaqi, who was one of the infamous Al-Qaeda spokespeople and activists originally from New Mexico, he made a very concerted effort to try to drive this wedge, through his speeches to Muslims, and also he believed through terrorist attacks, which he tried to inspire, like the underwear bombing and so on, is to make non-Muslims hate Muslims. Why? Because they believe that Muslims living in the West and Muslims, for example, in America, they should not be simply living here, coexisting peacefully. They feel that Muslims here who are doing that are actually hypocrites, and that in reality, Muslims need to be in a state of conflict and they need to be woken up. And the way to wake them up is to provoke attacks and to provoke hostility from non-Muslims towards Muslims, and that this, to the extent that they're able to generate this hostility, then the Muslims in America will kind of lean over towards their side, and they'll wake up, quote unquote, to the to the reality of as they see it. And so what we have as a result of that is, in fact, what could be expected, which is that these terrorist attacks have provided fodder for those non-Muslims who are inclined towards opposing most of the existence of Muslims in America. So, there are many activists, from bloggers to speakers and so on that did this. And so then we look at Steve Bannon, and the Trump administration. Steve Bannon is the one who inspired Trump to take this course of Muslim baiting as a means of tapping into a pre-existing emotion or sentiment that existed, and fomenting it, like all propaganda does. Yeah. And I would say that I don't think that we're seeing an increase in it, and I think a lot of Muslims might disagree with me. But look, it's a very important part of Muslim civil rights organizations to be magnifying or highlighting, let's say, the existence of such cases. But a lot of that has to do with fundraising, and a lot of that has to do with their maintaining their own reason for existence. I'm not saying that they're making these things up. No, there are those things that exist out there, but it's part of their it's part of the way that America operates with advocacy groups and so on and so on. That these things have to be maintained. I think that America in general is actually quite tolerant of Muslims, and but it's just one of the things that's very concerning as well is on the left, with the increasing secularism and increasing, let's say, like militancy of the ideology of not only gender and LGBT ideology, but also, as I mentioned, critical race theory and other secularizing tendencies. That these tendencies are resulting in Muslims keeping their religion private, or again, like the religion becoming secularized to where it just becomes an identity marker. And so this is actually as much, or if more than, a threat than an existential threat than it is dealing with acts of bigotry and so on.
A one-word answer, or maybe a short answer from you.
Yeah.
What do you think is the country that is most oppressive towards Muslims in the West or developed world?
Oh, France. There's no question. France is absolutely terrible. And so,
easy answer. We could probably have a whole podcast on why France sucks from multiple levels.
Yes.
I mean, I will say their food is quite delicious, along with their wine. I know you don't drink, but
their fries are good. But
hey, we're pro freedom fries.
Freedom fries.
Fries. Freedom toast.
Yeah, exactly. No, I have a whole webinar on France that I did with a couple of really interesting experts on the issue of both sides, representing both sides. Just Google webinar Islam and separatism in Europe.
Next question. Even as a mujahideen, did I say that correct?
Okay, so mujahideen is plural and mujahid is singular. So
mujahid. All right.
Yeah.
So even as a mujahid, you had a more nuanced understanding of the role of how maybe jihad should be practiced, or how
what it means.
Than say someone you met in prison, Richard Reed, who's the infamous shoe bomber. You believed in politically motivated violence between military combatants, while the shoe bomber advocated against any non-Islamic civilians, saying jihad becomes dutiful when enemies attack the lands of Muslims. Can you first please explain what jihad, and it's kind of bigger, it's kind of under the umbrella of Sharia, what both those mean linguistically and a little bit more religiously? I'm sure many people in the West still, and even if you Google jihad, the actual strict translation won't even come up. As someone that I've delved into it a little bit from Muslim sources, and even when you encounter liberal Western sources, they'll be like, it's religious warfare. I'm like, even me now, I'm like, I don't think that's technically accurate.
The contemporary, jihad movement really began with, of course, there's jihad in classical Islam. Talking about the contemporary period really can be traced to the Afghan rebellion or Afghan guerrilla war against the Soviet Union. In that, it originally was basically just a local Afghan response to this invasion by the Soviets, but it also had elements from very early on of quote unquote Islamism, which I could actually define in a little bit. But in other words, like sort of Islam that in a modern sense is kind of like taking the form of a political ideology, as opposed to Islam that would have been understood by the Afghans, the tribal or village Afghans or whatever, as just something, as a religion, yes, way of life that they had inherited from their parents, but didn't take the form of like a political program in the way that modern Islamism does that. And so that element came into it. Then you had forms of Islam like the Wahhabi, so-called Wahhabi Islam, coming from like the Gulf and other places as Arab volunteers came in. And this is not necessarily Islam. It's not really accurately defined that way, but it's a more, let's say, fundamentalist is actually the correct word in this situation. Fundamentalist type of Islam. So this began to influence the Afghan jihad also. Ultimately, in the end, what you get is this kind of mix of different ideologies. This created, there were different factions. There were different factions along this spectrum, and some of these people, some of the foreign people that came in there were people who had the idea of defeating the Soviets and establishing a government in Kabul or in Afghanistan that would have a government that was ruled by Islamic law and took its references from the Quran and from classical Islamic canon. Now, others then said, no, we don't want to just simply have Afghanistan. We want to continue on to liberate, in their view, all the the Muslim republics of the Soviet Union, like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and so on, which at that time were all occupied by the were part of the USSR. And then you had of odd, those I would describe as kind of like more mainstream. Now, other people might say that sounds actually very radical, but let's just say that, like, relative to the Afghan milieu, that those were like more moderate positions. And then you had a group that believed that was so far extreme, and that wanted to that actually believed that other people who disagreed with them were disbelievers, apostates, who were deserving of death. And these people didn't want to fight in Afghanistan at all. What they actually wanted to do was to use Afghanistan and use the area of Pakistan where the Arabs were staged. They wanted to use those areas as staging grounds for fomenting revolution in back home, like in Egypt and Algeria. And these people were really heavily influenced by almost a Leninist type of ideology. When I went to Bosnia and I, fought there, the Arabs that I was with and the people that I was with were kind of this mix of people who were on the one hand, just there to help defend Muslims from the Serbs, just to, they saw what was going on in the news. They wanted to come and volunteer. And then those who were more like religiously oriented, the people that I was with were from they had come from Afghanistan, actually. They were Arabs, Saudis that had come from Afghanistan. But these were people who were more just like, yes, they did want to establish like an Islamic government and in Afghanistan when they were there. But they weren't these nutcases who declared all Muslims to be disbelievers, who disagreed with them and who wanted, essentially to engage in revolution and, their own homeland and, cause chaos. Essentially like nihilist is what I would call them. So this segment, this strand, eventually was Al-Qaeda, and it eventually became ISIS, spun off into ISIS. I mean, inevitably. Now, ISIS, of course, declares Al-Qaeda to be disbelievers, but that's the way of these things, in the same way that the French Revolution, as they say, the revolution devours its children. So, each succeeding wave is more radical than the previous one until it, burns out. And so that's really what we're seeing with ISIS. So Richard Reed, as you mentioned, he was from this group that, was from this more radical Al-Qaeda thing. And so he and I we strongly disagreed. For me, jihad meant war by, between two militaries, and that's really, to me what it was. And it had nothing to do with, like either, the Egyptian style of, which is really Al-Qaeda, the Egyptian style of like suicide bombing or the, the Hamas type of stuff, bombing, buses and killing civilians, killing tourists. I mean, that to me was just lunacy. And like back then I kind of saw those guys as like, I would read about them in the paper, but I saw them as like being like fringe weirdos, like who are these people even, and since then I've met people like that actually, but at the time I really hadn't known anyone like that. They just weren't the mainstream, at least in the circles that I was in Bosnia. And so, then we look at, for example, like Lashkar-e-Taiba, who I had gotten involved with in Kashmir. And in 2000, when I went and, visited them, and they were stressing to me that they did not believe in attacks on civilians, that this was against Islam. And then in 2000, I guess it was 7 or whatever, they carried out these Mumbai attacks where they, it was just a vicious, sickening assault by people using military weapons on civilians, deliberately trying to kill them, non-combatants. To me, it was just I felt betrayed. I felt like, well, I've gone to prison for trying to help what I thought was a decent group of people, and I thought I had been doing the right thing. If you read you can Google and find my letter to my judge at my sentencing, and I was like, I was really just trying to do what I thought was right in terms of helping people throw off oppressive occupiers, and I had taken a very strict stance always against the harming of civilians, and I just felt it to be so cowardly. So that's really the difference between these two. Now you asked me to explain what jihad means and then sharia. Those are of course two different things. So jihad, jahada, it comes from the word jahada, which means to struggle or to strive. And it comes up in context in which that term is intended, or that meaning is intended. But the term jihad, in a sort of technical sense, does in fact primarily refer to military combat, primarily, and but again, like classically, it wasn't it wasn't terrorism. There are very, very strict rules of warfare that developed fairly robustly, these rules. And so you look at ISIS and Al Qaeda, and so what they do is they'll go through these classical works. See, they have their methodology, which they mostly got from communist terrorists and anarchists and so on. The hijacking, the suicide bombing, the planting bombs, and so on. And these are mostly, like I said, anarchist and communist in origin. They adopted these methodologies in the same way that they adopted many of their political and ideological views, adapted those from communism and anarchism and so on. And then they likewise adopted their terrorist strategies. And what they did, though, in order to convince Muslims that these were, and I guess to convince themselves that these were legitimate ways of behaving, they went back into classical works and tried to cherry pick through those, things that would seem to support, or at least that they could analogize from those things, from those statements of scholars of the past to support, what they're doing now. And so, for example, there's a hadith or a report of the Prophet Muhammad using a catapult. So they're using a catapult against the city. Of course, catapults were, used by everyone, and no one thought to say, oh, well, wait a minute, these rocks that were randomly flinging into a city might hit someone who doesn't deserve to be hit. So it's not that they were intending to kill just anyone randomly, but that's how you got cities to capitulate. So there's no doubt that because rocks are not like smart bombs, and they can't be aimed at any particular place or anything like that, then these things are prone to hitting those who are not combatants. But at the same time, what the scholars of old derived from that was that although it is prohibited to kill certain classes of people in war, when you have a catapult type situation and you're not intending to kill people, then it's permissible. So these people took that, Al Qaeda and Hamas and so on. They took these statements of old and they tried to extrapolate from those to say, okay, that's why we can put a bomb on our chests and go into a Sbarros full of children, specifically looking for a restaurant that has, and a time where there are many children in it and women and their mothers, and blow it up. So of course this is not at all the same thing as a catapult, but this is their how Satan is deluding them. So jihad in the classical period would have been declared by or authorized by the ruler in the same way that war is, that has as its aim the advancement of the Muslim interest. Strictly speaking, ideally and theoretically would have been the advancement of Islam, not in the sense of forcing people to become Muslim. The way that the Muslims, the way that Islamic polities and empires and so on worked at the time were very similar to the way the Roman Empire or all imperial sort of polities, which is that they had no interest in creating a homogenous society. What they were trying to do was establish, a certain order on the earth, and that others who didn't convert or whatever would continue to live as subject people. So that was the kind of polity was that, and certainly there were incentives applied, both positive and negative, to populations to convert. So populations that had been conquered were under no illusions as to who the ruler was, and that they had been conquered. But at the same time, they enjoyed a certain amount of autonomy and to run their own affairs. And so on. And this is the case. You can look at there were Muslim populations of the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople prior to the Turks conquering it. And likewise, the Roman Empire from its pagan times to its Christian times. This is just how imperial polities work. Yes, the Muslims saw themselves as representatives of God's divine order on the earth. And in the same way that where you see like the pilgrims coming to America and saying we have this shining city on the hill, we have this covenant, we have this order that we are establishing that reflects God's will, and and that's how that's what they saw themselves as doing. We can take this back, for example, to Babylon. The term Babylon, which is Bab means door or gate, and Elon is plural of El, or God. So it means gate of the gods. They saw them. They named their city that because to them Babylon was the point at which the divine entered into this world. So that seems very strange to us today, but that is indeed how they saw themselves. And so the term. Let's go to the term Sharia. The term Sharia means God's law as God intended it for the Muslims. And so Sharia law, the law refers to jurisprudence. The field of jurisprudence deals with many things in the same way that like the Jewish law deals with the proper way to slaughter, the proper way to get married, conduct oneself in marriage, and business. This is a major part of jurisprudence, is how business is to be ethically conducted in a way that is pleasing to God, and so on. It deals with all this. It deals even with let's say how I purify myself for the prayer. There are certain rulings, or the prayer itself has certain rulings that if I omit certain things from it, then the ritual is not accepted to God, and so on. So what people commonly now know as Sharia when it comes to is when it comes to the issue of government, and particularly speaking in judicial proceedings. You have Sharia insofar as it relates to criminal punishment or criminal law, and the Sharia includes not only let's say the punishments themselves, but also includes how judges are to judge. And in other words, a kind of philosophy of jurisprudence, which contains many axioms and so on. And it's much closer to a kind of common law because it originally was not codified. It was instead kind of developed through opinions where scholars through kind of like a syllogistic reasoning would say, okay, well, here's the general principle and here's the case before me, or the principles, and here's a case before me, and how to apply those principles to this case before me, and then this is the result. So it definitely involved things like lawsuits, someone was supposed to pay me and they, for a shipment of weed or something, and they didn't, and so you go before the court, and so what's the ruling there, or whatever. So what people know mostly about Sharia now is they hear about things like the criminal punishments, like for adultery, like stoning, or for stealing, having one's hand cut off, and so on. But what's interesting is that the principles, like the aims of the Sharia, are very, very important, and they were derived by scholars who looked at the total body of rulings that were found in the Quran and the statements of the Prophet, and they derived from those things 5 primary aims of the Sharia. One is the protection of life. That's the first one. There's some, which one comes first, I actually can't recall whether it's life or it's religion. But anyway, protection of life, protection of religion, protection of consciousness or the intellect, protection of property, and protection of family or lineage. And so Islamic scholars found that all rulings in the Sharia, regardless of what subject or topic, are aimed at one of these 5. And so that if some particular ruling in a particular case contradicted one of these, then it would not be valid or appropriate in that given situation. So it's interesting that if you look at what Aquinas said was the first principle of natural law, he also included there like promoting good and preventing harm. And so that's one of the principles the scholars derived of the divine law. And so as harsh as some of those punishments sound, in reality, the aim is one of those 5 things which really all people would recognize, all reasonable people would recognize those 5 things as goods that are to be promoted. So when we ask ourselves, like, okay, so how does that apply in a situation where Muslims are not ruling? Well, it's easy, because essentially I just conduct myself. First of all, I have a set of things that continue to apply. For example,
right.
Like I'm not allowed to, I'm not allowed to eat pork. I'm not allowed to, drink alcohol. I'm not allowed to have an abortion or something like that. Depending on there's some nuance there in terms of which school of thought one's following, but in generally speaking, one's not allowed to. So in not doing those things, I'm obeying the Sharia. I'm following the Sharia in not doing those things, And so those are examples, And so then let's say, okay, well, what if I'm to say in public life, in my ethical decisions? Okay, so first of all, I'm not allowed to charge people interest. So if I have a business, or if I have I'm in a business or something, and or in my personal life, I just loan someone something, and someone says, okay, can I borrow $100? I say, sure. And they say, try to return it back to me. And they say, here's 110. I say, no, I have to say, I can't take that $10. I'm only going to take 100. In that right there, that's Sharia. That I'm obeying the Sharia in that situation. So let's take it further and say, like, what about in political life? Then in that case, I would, for example, as a citizen, I see that there's an initiative up, for like they want to increase gambling, in Pennsylvania or something, then I would oppose it, because gambling is forbidden, and it's forbidden. Why? Because it says in the Quran, because the harm is greater than the good. That there's some good comes of it, no doubt. It says this in the Quran, but that the harm is greater than the good. And clearly, like empirically, we can see that that's the case. But in any event, I trust that, because God said so, that's the case. And so I'll oppose that thing. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm trying to like impose my religion on other people or something like that. But it just acts as an ethical guide to me in how I conduct my affairs. Now, or for example, legalizing marijuana. I cannot agree. I cannot like support as a citizen. And not only that, I would have an obligation to say, no, that's something that we should not do as a society. We should not legalize marijuana. Why? Because it corrupts the intellect. And because as a Muslim, I know that what God wants for human beings is that their intellect not be corrupted. And so I would oppose that. Now, then there's arguments about, but it has certain effects that have like racial disparities. Okay, so let's look for ways to address those things. No one should go to prison for 10 years for having a bag of marijuana, for example. But
you'll have to talk to Kamala Harris about that.
Yeah, right, exactly. Right. But that's something we can agree on. We could agree that like people shouldn't. I've known people who've done, especially like the 3 strikes and stuff like that. Right. But at the same time, like there should at least be some sort of symbolic. Or, for example, you look at same-sex marriage. We would say no, that should be that should not be allowed. That should not be part of the definition of marriage because for many reasons. Because it undermines, for one thing, it undermines the family. And so we have these obligations. Now, if we are not able to, in talking about the American context, if I'm not able to persuade my fellow citizens of the rightness of my position, then then they win. You know what I mean? Then the wrong prevails, and I've at least done my best to try to aim for what is good. But in the end, ultimately, I'm aiming for the common good and for the good of everyone. And, there's no kind of like aim to try to, replace American law with the Sharia and so on and so on. That's absurd. As a matter of fact, I would say that insofar as the United States polity and the United States American order is based on natural law, then there's very much an overlap between our faith, at least between our law, Islamic law, at least in its aims and principles, which are the same as, more or less, the same as those identified by natural law philosophers. So I can look at natural law as developed by Christians. Just what happens when you begin to argue from that, and what conclusions do you come to? Mm-hmm. And then those are things that people can dispute.
So natural law, right? I think in Christianity there's been a growing liberalism, and it's been a long time coming. Right. There's an opinion article in the NYT New York Times mm-hmm. that I thought was very parallel to many problems in the conservative American church, entitled "The mm-hmm. Creeping Liberalism in American Islam." What's 2 aspects of cultural liberalism do you find that is beginning to influence Muslims in the States specifically?
Well, okay. So here's the thing. I mean, this article is by a personal friend of mine, Mustafa Ekyol. I don't agree with him on many things. His article here, and I haven't read it for a little while. He's on to many things in the terms of, he has astutely observed this liberalizing of Muslims in America. I mean, that's something I myself have written on a great deal. The difficulty I have, I think, with this is that he's kind of saying that it's a good thing in a way, in a sense, and he's contrasting this liberalism with the supposed creeping Sharia that certain people on the far right, certain corners of the far right, let's say, have been warning about and so on. But the problem is that these are not like the only 2 alternatives. It's not like on the one hand you have, let's all just adopt the fashionable ideologies of the day and replace Islamic principles with these ideologies. So, like, yes, it's true that we are against abortion, but now we're all going to accept it. Yes, it's true that we're against gay marriage, but yes, now we're all going to support it. And that's not like the solution or the like good alternative to this fantasy of creeping Sharia, which is, as I said, a fantasy, or on the other hand, like the actual really existing extremists out there who have some sort of fantasy about, and there are not very many actually in America, but some kind of fantasy about imposing Sharia in America. And I don't know anyone who, aside from like maybe a handful of people who I've met, who are actually into that. But anyway, you see my point. I mean, but there's an alternative paradigm to these things, and that is to be a Muslim in America, believing in your faith, holding to your principles, and at the same time recognizing that we do live in a pluralistic society of people of many different beliefs, and so trying to we're trying to find common cause with those whose beliefs those whose principles align with yours, and that could be people that differ on different issues. So for example, if it comes to criminal justice reform, and you have a great deal of injustice in the criminal justice system,
right.
and so to say, all right, well, I'll work with the ACLU, or I'll work with whoever to advance justice in those areas, and which also, by the way, many conservatives are also a part of that movement for criminal justice reform. And then on the other hand, let's say, okay, look at abortion and say, okay, well, yes, it's true that there are some liberal interpretations of Islam that are more flexible on it, but nevertheless, like that, we can all agree that Roe v. Wade is a horrific injustice to the unborn children, and so let's work together with those who oppose that. Now, naturally, the fact is that because Muslims believe in the Day of Judgment, we believe in God, we believe in we believe in prophecy, we believe in that our actions are judged by a judge greater than humanity, and greater than the creation, then naturally it would seem that we would have a great deal of common ground with Christians and Jews who believe those same things. And so it's sort of a historical accident why one sees less of that coming to fruition than is. But that's something that I'm very actively working to remedy. But that at the same time doesn't mean that I would that I don't advocate for working closely with, animal rights, for example. I'm or the environment, because those are things that Muslims are for, as being for good stewardship of the creation, So anyway, that's essentially my shortest answer I think I could give.
What's your favorite surah or ayah, chapter, verse in the Quran?
No, that's a really good question. So surah is sort of like Arabic for chapter, and ayah is verse. That would be surah number 57, verse 3. And so it says, "He is the first and the last, the most obvious or the most manifest and the most hidden, and he is a knower of everything." So these are verses describing God, and I just find that to be so profound. And those are verses that I read that's a verse that I read when I want to remind myself of the grandeur and the magnitude of the Lord of the worlds. Yeah.
And I guess one more little question, since most people are not going to learn classical Arabic. Is there a certain translation in English that you like, or you think is, quote, best? I know there's wide range of that.
I would recommend two. One is a translation by a guy named Abdul Halim, Haleem. It's a very good translation, and it's out there. One can find it in paperback and so on. And then there's another one, which is Yusuf Ali, which is a classic one that's been around for a long time. And that one's also very good. So I tend to go between those two. Excellent.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Ismail. Do you want to plug anything? I know anything coming up at Institute for Religious Freedom or anything like that? I know you're off Twitter, so I'm sure you can say hi to all your former followers.
Hi.
Everybody needs to get off Twitter.
I miss you guys, but I just had to maintain my sanity. Yes. Well, I'm still on Twitter in the sense that I still run the professional account, which is the Islam and Religious Freedom Action Team account. So, yes, we're preparing in May for a symposium that we're doing in partnership with the University of Chicago that will feature 25 scholars. 25 Jewish, Muslim, and Christian scholars. So this is really an amazing, and we have some very, very high level scholars, and these are very serious theologians, philosophers, political scientists, all in one place to discuss virtue ethics, the common good, and how Islam, Christianity, and Judaism have an overlapping, or to what extent they have an overlapping idea of the virtues and the common good.
Will that be over Zoom, or will that be in presentation?
It's going to be in person at the University of Chicago, but it will be live streamed. And so it's not ready. The link to that won't be ready for a few weeks, but I will definitely keep you updated. And the papers that are that come as a result of that will be published in an academic volume, and other types of resources will come out of that, such as curricula and so on virtue.
Great.
So
I look forward to that. Again, thank you for coming on and indulging us.
Yeah.
And
thank you, Ismail.
Wish you well in your endeavors.
Thank you so much. It's been great to talk to both of you, and best of luck. God bless.
Bless you, brother.
Okay.
I hope you all enjoyed the podcast. If it didn't shine through, we are hoping that with a little more knowledge about Islam, the Christian-Muslim divide in the West can be bridged. We feel like this is needed. As the culture and government secularizes, both will probably be more hostile towards traditional religion and its expression. Thus, we think it will be necessary for a white, middle-class, conservative church to reach across the historical chasm and work with Black Protestants, Hispanic Catholics, Orthodox Jews, and even traditional Muslims. We hope we can all strive together for religious freedom, but also for criminal justice reform, immigration reform, anti-abortion efforts, racial healing, feeding the hungry, housing the homeless and the sojourner, giving jobs to the unemployed, and just overall loving our neighbor, even if you think he or she is an enemy. That requires hard, unnoticed labor, the awkward start of a new friendship over a cup of coffee, taking time out of your hectic day to read something you don't agree with, or to attend a different church tradition that's well outside your comfort zone, or even to visit a local mosque or synagogue. As someone who, before the pandemic, regularly visited my local mosque once or twice a month for 2 years, I can say they were accommodating and pleasant. Just Google what is near you and email them. A Catholic or Black church, a synagogue, or even a mosque. Might be surprised what you find out about them, or even yourself. Have a great day, and thank you for indulging me.